It's interesting when you're talking about how you kind of your awareness of your sexuality came later in your 20s, and a lot of it came from writing Priory. Kind of that was kind of like an awakening. That's kind of such an amazing thing, I think, for you as a writer, and I imagine for so many readers to be able that really comes through, I think, in the writing.
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing it, I mean, I didn't know from the moment I set out to write Priory. I just was very drawn to the idea of a romance between two women in this particular intimate setting, which was that of the royal bedchamber. And I was very inspired by Elizabeth I's relationship with her ladies in waiting, which, as far as we know, was not romantic. But well, the particular thing I was interested in was that Elizabeth would often have bedfellows who would sleep with her in a platonic sense to essentially stop her being afraid of the dark, just to generally be there, often for warmth and companionship. This was very common in the Elizabethan era. You would often share a bed with a same-sex partner, just purely for kind of mostly warmth, because they didn't have central heating. So that was the kind of conceit I was using to build a relationship on. And then the more I wrote it, the more I was like, oh, this is tapping into something a bit more personal than I realized. So that was an interesting coming out story.
Truly.
But yeah, it was a nice way to sit and think about it in like expressing it through someone else's story in a way.
And I say kind of also then for Dumai to kind of have that not similar experience, not sit down and write a book, but as you say, kind of later in her 20s as well. And I just think all of the relationships are handled so beautifully. And as I said earlier, you have such a diversity in terms of, queer relationships are very normalized in the book. And then, I know you've done the same thing in Bone Season. Kind of you've spoken about before that you feel like with fantasy, you can make that a reality.
Yeah, like I think that there should always be space for books that explore things like homophobia. I think if, especially if a writer's been through that themselves and they want a safe space to be able to express and explore that subject, I think that's really important. But I also think that there has been such respect for historical accuracy in fantasy that it means that there has for a while been an expectation of, for example, violence against women in fantasy, because there's this idea that fantasy has to be faithful to history, and that therefore we have to replicate certain types of real world oppression even in fantasy novels. And I disagree with that. I think you can explore those subjects in fantasy novels, and like I said, I think it can be very important and empowering to do that. But it should not be an expectation of a genre that there should be, say, violence against women or homophobia or any sort of oppression or violence from the real world does not necessarily need to be mirrored in a fantasy setting. You can step away from that, and I wanted to do that with this book. I do explore certain kinds of patriarchy in the Roots of Chaos books. So the structural patriarchy of hereditary monarchy, for example. So that is very important in the books, especially when it comes to Glorian's bodily autonomy, for example. But I didn't want to have this sort of misogyny where people would say, oh, you can't rule because you're a woman, or you can't be a knight because you're a woman. And that was similar with the idea of homophobia. Again, there is kind of an implicit homophobia in the hereditary monarchy system, but I didn't want it to be kind of a casual homophobia where I didn't want to have to be, a lot of the time I read fantasy books and I feel I have to brace for misogyny, and I didn't want that to be the case in these books.
No, it definitely is a celebration of, we don't like strong female characters, but female strength rather, and all in all of its kind of glory and varieties.